Hey guys, welcome to the third installment of my SDL Video Tutorials. In the last installment, we learned how to create a window, but the window did nothing. So now what we're going to do is learn how to use input in a structured way so that we can close our window and resize it and do other such things with it. So first you'll want to add a new file to your project, input_core.h. So what this class is going to do is basically just be the core for our input. It's going to contain a bunch of functions that correspond to different events that happen. So first we have our constructor and destructor. Now this is going to be a virtual class. The reason being is because we're going to have another class inherit from it, so then it will get all these functions and it can provide its own implementations. So the biggest function we have, and really the only function that has an implementation in this class, is onEvent. So what this does is you'll pass in an event, and then it will parse through all those events, and then it will call one of these functions. So now that we have our input core class header file set up, go ahead and add another file to your project, inputcore.cpp. In this file, we're just going to implement the onEvent function. So first what we're going to do is implement a switch statement. And in the switch statement, we're going to go through the cases of all the different events we want to provide support for. So you can expand on what I've done, but what I have is SDL key down, SDL key up, SDL mouse motion, SDL mouse button down, SDL mouse button up, SDL active event, SDL video resize, and SDL quit. There's more SDL events, and you can choose to expand on it if you choose so. So basically, what is an event? An event simply is anything that happens. Okay, so let's say you click. What's going to happen is the computer is going to read that click, and then SDL is going to store it in some type of queue. Then a certain function that you call, which I'll show later, is going to take the first event off that queue, and it's going to stuff it into an SDL event structure. So just to show you, I'm going to open up the SDL docs and give you a little insight into the SDL event union. So let me open up the docs really quick. Alright, API documentation and event handling. So basically it's a union, and you have SDL event, which has, let me scroll down. See, it's a union, and it has a type, and then it has a bunch of different other structures in it. Why, you may ask? Because you can only have one event stored in the structure at a time. It uses a union because the union makes sure that all the different members share the same space, so it's a lot more efficient than if you just use an actual structure. So depending on what type of event you have will depend on which one of these is actually filled out. So going back to our code, on the first one, SDL key down, that's called when you press a key. So when you press a key, there's a bunch of different data that corresponds with that. So going back to the SDL documents, if you go to the keyboard event, you can see what it has in there. It tells you the type, which is either going to be SDL key down or SDL key up. Then you're going to have the state, which is whether it's pressed or released, which you can check with SDL pressed or SDL released. Then you also have a key sim. Now what the key sim is going to give you is a bunch of information regarding what key is actually pressed. So you have the sim, which is basically just a define in SDL. So it might be SDLK up for the up key, or SDLK M for the M key. And it's going to basically detail what key was actually pressed. SDL mod provides what modifiers are actually pressed, so buttons like Control, Shift, or Alt. The last thing is Unicode. Unicode is usually used to provide an easy way to translate from key presses to text. So you're going to use that if you want to have string input from the user. So that's all there is in a key event. It's really the same between key up and key down. So if we go back to our input core really quick, you notice we have an on key press and an on key release function. So that's going to correspond to SDL key down, SDL key up. And just as a note, if you want to know the different defines for all the different events, they're also located in the SDL documentation. So I'll show you that really quickly. If you go right, SDL event structures, SDL event shows you them down here, as you can see in this table, and it tells you what event it corresponds to. And you can just go through this and find the different data associated with it, but I'm going to only explain the core pieces, and we'll build on it next time when we learn to load images. Now moving on, after explaining SDL key down and SDL key up, we have mouse motion. So SDL mouse motion events occur when you move the mouse, and there's a number of different data that I've supplied with it. First, there's an X, a Y, a relative X, and a relative Y. But then we also are going to pass in these. What these are basically simple little things to check if a button's pressed down. So that's basically going to check if you held down the left button and dragged, or the middle button and dragged, or the right button and dragged. So the first two parameters, X and Y, are going to be the new position of the cursor. The relative X and relative Y are going to give kind of a speed of the mouse, like just so you have an idea of what direction it was moving in. And then what this does, you don't really need to be too focused on it, but really you're just going through bits to check to make sure this button is pressed down. You shouldn't worry too much about it, but from C++ you should know what this does. Anding two bits together is basically, if you have a 0 and a 1, then it's false. So on and off equals off, on and on equals on, so that will check to make sure that button's down. Okay, so that's for the mouse motion. For the mouse button down, I pass in the button that's pressed and then the position with the X and Y. Then you have the same thing with SDL mouse button up. Then you also have active event. What an active event is when focus changes. So that's kind of like when you minimize the window, or when the window isn't the active window anymore. So as you can see, the window I'm in, code blocks, is right now the active window. But if I were to click, let's say, on this folder that I have up, now this is the active window, and now code blocks isn't getting input. So that's kind of what it does. I'm not really going to show you how to use that, but I do have support for that, so if you want to do it, then go ahead. SDL video resize is called when you try to resize the window, and the only parameters associated with it are the new width and the new height. The last one is SDL quit. An SDL quit event is executed when you click the X, so you just want an on exit with no parameters. So now you can